Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John O'Sullivan. I'm the president of the Danube Institute. I'd like to welcome you to this discussion this morning on behalf of the Institute and on behalf also of the European People's Party, which is the other sponsor, for whom, of course, whose representative in the European Parliament, Mr. Schottlein, is. Well, I normally say just a very few words about the work of the Danube Institute, and I'll do so again because I see one or two new faces in the audience who don't know about our work. We're just entering the end of our fifth year. We launched ourselves in 2013 with a conference on the causes, consequences, and cures of the 2008 financial crash. Our purpose is to be a forum for discussion in Central Europe for the centre-right, for classical liberals, for conservatives, and our general position as an institute is to plant the flag of classical liberalism in economics, conservatism in history and culture, and Atlanticism in foreign policy. But we're also great believers in debate. We feel that there would be less conflict in Central Europe if there were more debate, and therefore we encourage and try to ensure at all our conferences that in addition to people representing a centre-right point of view, we also discuss matters and have representatives of the democratic opponents on the social democratic side. On this occasion, we have a discussion of an extremely hot topic. In fact, it's so hot that even as in the last few days we've been rewriting the blurb to describe the conference. It was originally to discuss a vote, which in the event did not occur in Parliament, but since it didn't occur, two important things have happened. One is that Mrs. May stood for there was a vote of confidence on Theresa May as leader of the Conservative Party, which she won with a majority, with 200 votes over 117. That's a decisive victory in one sense, and she can't be challenged again by a vote of confidence for another year. At the same time, to have 117 members of your own party in the House of Commons voting against you also suggests strong signs of dissent among Conservative MPs as well. I don't think anyone doubted that anyway, because the vote to leave the European Union, taken in the referendum in 2016, was a great shock to politicians in all parties, and it's taken them a long time to reorient themselves to it. But there is now, I would say, roughly three positions in British politics. There are people who want to remain. There are people who want to leave in a decisive, complete and clear way. That's often known as no-deal Brexit, but it really means leaving the European Union and trading with the rest of the world on the terms regulated by the World Trade Organization. And then between those two fairly clear positions, there are different positions of what might be called soft Brexit, what is called soft Brexit, and they represent variations on a scale between just leaving and almost leaving and leaving, but remaining very much a member of certain European or EU institutions. Now, we couldn't have two better people to discuss this than Peter Lilley and George Schottlein. George, I think a lot of the people in the audience know well, because he was originally during the Cold War, he was a distinguished professor of political thought at London School of Economics and other places, and had an established position in British life, which after 1989, he left and returned to Hungary, where he entered politics and is now, I think, coming to the end of his time as a member of the European Parliament. He will not contest the next election. And I won't say this is your last hurrah, because I think you've got many, many last hurrahs in front of you, George. But at the same time, we're delighted that this is an occasion in which we can express our gratitude to him. Peter Lilley is a member of the House of Lords, but that is a disguise for a very distinguished political career, which included, of course, he was Deputy Prime Minister, he was a member of both Mrs. Thatcher's and John Major's cabinets, Deputy Prime Minister, and held a number of important ministerial positions. I suppose, we'll leave it to Peter to say, but the Secretary of State for Trade and Industry was one of the most important, because it, among other things, meant he represented Britain at international trade talks, and therefore speaks with particular authority on that question. Now, I'm going to invite Peter Lilley first to open the debate with a discussion of about 12-15 minutes. Then I will invite George to follow him. I will then ask a few questions, and then I will throw open the debate to members of the floor, and we will go from there. So on behalf of you all, I welcome both speakers, and I invite Peter Lilley to address us.
Thank you very much indeed, John. And can I say what a pleasure it is and privilege to be invited back. Last time I was in Budapest was nearly 50 years ago. And I can assure you it won't be as long again before I return. I think I can safely say that. I congratulate the Danube Institute on their timing of this discussion. It couldn't be more central an issue and height of discussion and importance. I thought it would be helpful if I set out a few facts to enable our discussion to proceed. First of all, what did the British electorate vote for when they voted to leave the European Union? Second, what were they offered in the subsequent general election in 2017? Third, what are they now being offered in the deal that Mrs. May has negotiated with the European Union? And fourth, what will they finally get at the end of the day? There's lots of speculation about why people voted. I've always found the easiest way to find out why people voted is to ask them. And there were polls carried out of people leaving the polling stations on the day of the election, and they reached the same conclusion. Roughly half the people voting to leave said the most important issue was getting back control of our laws. A third said it was getting back control of our borders, i.e. being able to control immigration and trade. And a sixth said it was about getting back control of our money. And indeed the slogan throughout the election, the referendum campaign of the Leave campaign was take back control of our laws, our borders and our money. The second question is, what were people promised in the subsequent general election in 2017? Both major parties promised that they would implement the decision of the referendum. The Conservative Party, which despite losing some seats, offset by gains in Scotland, or partly offset by gains in Scotland, promised that we would leave the single market, leave the customs union, leave subjection to the European Court of Justice, and that no deal was better than a bad deal. Three parties at that election promised a second referendum, or not implementing the result of the first. All three parties lost share of the vote. The two main parties increased their share of the vote on promises to implement the result of the election. So it was pretty clear in the referendum what people were voting for. It was reinforced by the subsequent general election. Subsequently, the Prime Minister reiterated those promises that we would leave the customs union, we would leave the single market, we would no longer be subject to European laws and the European Court of Justice, and that no deal was better than a bad deal. In particular, she said no Prime Minister, no British Prime Minister of any party could possibly accept a border of any kind between Great Britain and Northern Ireland down the middle of the United Kingdom. What are they now offered? They're offered a deal, which she came back with, which conflicts with all the promises previously made. First of all, Britain is to pay £39 billion to the European Union. Secondly, we get in return for that a transition period. Originally, the government said it would be an implementation period. In other words, we'd have agreed what the arrangements were going to be, and we would have 2 years to implement them. Now it's a transition period when we will continue to negotiate what the trading arrangements between ourselves and the European Union will be. Third, and most contentious, there is what's called the Irish Protocol. It was agreed by all parties that we did not want to see a hard border, that is to say infrastructure and checks carried out on the border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. But to achieve that, the agreement says the whole United Kingdom will for 2 years continue to be subject to the same external tariff, the customs union, and the same internal laws of the single market. And if no agreement has been reached on something else at the end of 2 years, then either it can be prolonged for another one time by agreement between both parties for an indeterminate period. I mean, they can agree what that determinate period will be. Or Northern Ireland will be separate from the Great Britain. Anyone exporting goods from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, part of our same country, will have to fill in customs returns, though not in the other direction. And Northern Ireland will remain subject to European law and the external tariff of the European Union. And then finally, the United Kingdom will have no right to leave that arrangement. Currently, under the European treaties, we have the right to leave by giving notice, and in 2 years we've left. We give up that right under this proposed deal, and this is the most contentious bit of the whole deal, because we would only be able to leave with the permission of the European Union. And the whole deal would be adjudicated by the European Court of Justice. That's accompanied, all that will be in a treaty and legally binding. It's accompanied by a political declaration about what the future relationship between Britain and Europe will be in terms of trade and cooperation on other matters, and that is extremely vague. The Prime Minister promised that it would be detailed, but it's extremely vague, and it effectively means that we will continue to discuss whether we will have a free trade area or a customs union or whatever. When that was brought back by the Prime Minister, she thought she could persuade people to vote for it by saying it was the only deal on offer. If they didn't do that, then either there'd be no Brexit or there'd be a second or there'd be no deal. That didn't put members of Parliament off. All the opposition parties said they'd oppose it, maybe for tactical and political reasons, but over 100 Conservative members said they wouldn't support it, which would have meant that the whole deal would have been defeated by over 200 votes. So the Prime Minister at the last minute called off the vote and said she'd go back and ask for what she described as some assurances, i.e. nothing legally binding, just some fond words. At this point, enough Conservative members were prompted to send in letters demanding a vote of confidence within the Conservative parliamentary party in her leadership. Requires 15%, i.e. 48, to do that, and they rapidly appeared. There was a vote. She held it immediately the same day to try and wrong-foot the opposition, and won by 200 votes to 117, which meant more than half her backbenchers voted against her. Well, the ministers obviously had to vote for her, though some secretly may not have done so. And that has left her in a weakened position. So what now is likely? Well, the Prime Minister is swanning around the capitals of Europe, begging for some help to get this deal through the British Parliament. It's extremely unlikely that the European countries will want to change an agreement which she had reached with them. They will probably be unlikely to offer anything except assurances. What she would like is clearly a time limit to this promise to keep Northern Ireland in the European Union, even if the rest of the United Kingdom effectively leaves the customs union and the single market, and to have some time limit on that. It's very unlikely she'll get it. So we're then in an extraordinary situation. She'll come back with a deal which still a majority in Parliament will not accept. So what then? Well, I can tell you what ought to happen then. I can't tell you what will happen then. What ought to happen then is that she, or whoever, because she may still be replaced at that point, her cabinet may no longer be able to tolerate her, whoever is the Prime Minister should go back to the European Union and say, you did offer us a simple free trade deal. Back on the 7th of March, President Tusk, the President of the European Council, offered Britain a simple free trade deal like that which had been negotiated with Canada. He called it Canada plus, so it would be a free trade deal plus cooperation on a range of other things. He repeated that offer in October, but it was turned down by the British government on the assumption that that offer would not extend to Northern Ireland, although actually Tusk phrased his offer in terms of an offer to the United Kingdom. But they may have been told that in private, so that left the Irish issue to be solved. The Irish issue, I'll come on to in a minute, is a sort of non-issue. We know it's a non-issue because the British government has said, under no circumstances will we erect border posts on the Irish border or require people trading across the border to stop and be checked at the border. They'll have to fill in customs declarations, but that's done electronically before you depart and, or at the end of the month. And there are differences either side of the border at the moment, which we regulate without any border posts. So that we've said there'll be no border posts. When the Prime Minister of Southern Ireland has been asked in his Parliament, if there's no deal, will you erect a hard border? He said no, in no circumstances will the South erect border posts or carry out checks on the border. Mr. Juncker, when he appeared before the Irish Parliament, was asked in the same terms, will the European Union insist on border posts and checks on the border? And he emphatically said no, they will not. They will resolve the problem without border posts. So clearly all three parties believe it can be resolved without border posts and without keeping the laws, both sides of the border, identical. And as I say, we do that at present. The rates of duty on things like alcohol and tobacco are different either side of the border. One of the main items of trade across the border is alcoholic beverages. Guinness, famously made in the south, and various other alcoholic beverages famously made in the north. They travel back and forth in the process of manufacture, 18,000 lorries a year. We, nonetheless, regulate that without stopping anybody at the border or requiring it. It all has to be declared electronically and it's appropriately supervised. Why then has it become such a big issue? Because there were elements within the British government, particularly the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Treasury, who wanted to make it an issue because they wanted to keep Britain in the customs union. And so by accepting the demands of the Irish government and the European government that they promised to keep rules either side of the border identical, they're effectively promising to keep us in the customs union, which they wanted. So it was a concession which wasn't so much dragged out of the British government as voluntarily given by elements in the British government in contradiction of the pledges made to the electorate at the last election and voted for in the referendum. So the Irish issue is soluble by simply replacing the Irish protocol in the existing treaty by a renewed commitment, in writing from all three parties, the EU, the Irish government and the British government, that they will not erect border posts and carry out checks on the border, but deal with it all by administrative processes away from the border, as we do at present for other things and could do in future. If that was agreed, then we could have a straight free trade deal Canada plus plus plus, as we call it in British jargon, and all be fine and dandy, though the Treasury would say, well, that's not as good as being part of a customs union. Alternatively, it won't be agreed, and the European Union will say, sorry, we're withdrawing that offer, or it's only available if you keep all these Irish Protocol arrangements, in which case we will leave on the 29th of March without a withdrawal agreement. Is that a big deal or big non-deal? Not really. As John said, I was involved in the negotiations, the Uruguay round, which set up the WTO. We'd be trading on WTO terms. The WTO is designed to provide a basic framework in which nations can trade with each other without discrimination, offering each other what's called the most favoured nation tariffs, so they cannot impose tariffs on other people's goods higher than they do to the generality of other countries, and with a dispute resolution procedure if there is any dispute about anything. So that's the basic framework on which countries trade. We currently trade on WTO terms with a whole range of countries, like the United States of America, for example, our biggest single national trading partner, and others. Our trade with the countries with whom we only trade on WTO terms has risen 3 times as fast as our trade with our partners in the single market since it was established. I happened also to be the minister that was responsible for introducing the single market legislation in the United Kingdom, and I made lots of speeches saying this was going to be wonderful and boost our trade. It has a bit, but not very much. Fortunately, I was also responsible for the WTO, so I made lots of speeches about that and said how it would boost our trade, and it has rather more. Trade terms, it's not bad to trade on WTO terms, better to have a free trade deal. On WTO terms, our exports to Europe would face an average tariff of 4%. Since the referendum was called, our exchange rate has moved to make our exporters 15% more competitive. So it would offset 4 percentage points of that 15%. Not the end of the world. They would still be more competitive than they were before the referendum was held. But of course, an average of 4% conceals differences. Some tariffs are much higher, particularly on agricultural goods. On motor cars, they're 10%. So we would have to support those industries in other ways. Would we be able to? Well, the total of 4% tariffs on our exports would cost us between £5 and £6 billion. We'd save, in terms of our net contribution to the European Union, £10 billion. So overall, we'd be better off. In terms of the tariffs we would levy if we kept the same external tariff and applied it to exports from the EU, whereas our exporters would have to pay 5 or 6 billion on imports, that would cost the exporters from Europe 13 billion. Why so much more? A, because they export far more to us than we export to them, and B, because they export goods which are highly protected, like motor cars, whereas we export goods which are internationally competitive and have low tariffs. So overall, we would be financially better off under WTO terms, and we'd be in a position to negotiate a free trade deal, as other countries outside the European Union have done. So to me, it's not bad. I hope we reach an agreement. I hope it includes a Canada-style free trade deal. I'm not sure that we will achieve that, but either way, Britain will be able to fulfill the wishes of its electorate. Thank you.
Now let me invite George Shoflin to address us. Thank you, Peter.
So, thank you very much, John. Good morning, everybody. It won't surprise you that my perspective is somewhat different from Peter Lilley's. What I want to do is to look at what is happening from, to some extent, a Hungarian, to some extent, a Brussels perspective. And there are differences. Some of these are significant, some of it are not. Let me start by clarifying my own position on Brexit. I'm what is called as a regretter. That's to say, I regret the outcome, but I accept it absolutely. Majorities have rights. And in this instance, a majority voted to leave the European Union, and I think that's the political reality with which we have to live. But looking at what has been happening from the Brussels, or indeed to some extent the Strasbourg perspective, I was in Strasbourg this week, a few hundred meters from where the shooting took place, but it's okay. We were quite safe. Exciting times. This is the second most exciting event of the week. So what I want to start out by suggesting to you is that what is missing, I think, from the British perspective, from what Peter Lilley has said, and indeed from what I read in the British media, is that the European Union will not disappear. It will continue to be a factor in British politics. And I think that this perspective is, to this date, to the best that I can make out, absent from the British discussion. And I think that the United Kingdom will have to come to terms with this, that the European Union will not just vanish into thin air. It will be present and will play a role, directly, indirectly, in British United Kingdom politics. Whether or not there's Canada plus, it doesn't really matter. The 27 are a really major economic as well as obviously political and indeed cultural factor. It doesn't just affect the United Kingdom, of course, it affects in a way every country in the world. So what I'm suggesting to you is that the European Union is a stakeholder in what happens in the United Kingdom. Obvious issues, trade, with which Peter has dealt very thoroughly. I would add the citizens. That's to say the UK citizens in the 27 and the EU citizens in the United Kingdom. We're talking of roughly 3-something million, what their rights are in both directions. And I think that this is largely settled, but there are some concerns on the EU side as to what kind of deal, in practice, what will actually happen to the citizens. And I would suggest to you that the United Kingdom was a member of the European Union for a long time, and that membership has left a mark. It can't be eradicated by a simple departure. The way in which the United Kingdom economy is structured, to some much lesser extent the United Kingdom thinking, politics and so on, has obviously been affected by these 4 decades, and it can't just be undone. It will in many ways affect the way in which, it already affects the way in which things are done in the United Kingdom. It can be dismantled very slowly, but it can never be dismantled completely. In the same way that the United States is a stakeholder in what happens in the European, and to some extent vice versa. The asymmetry of power, one can't get away from this, whether we like it or not. I happen not to like it because as a Hungarian I realise that we are in a certain asymmetry of power with a very large number of other countries, but it's still a reality, and that I think has to be one of the starting points. So what I find fascinating in this very, very interesting relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union, the 27, is that we have shared interests, but we have very little shared identity. In the decades when I lived in the European Union, in the United Kingdom, the European Union was never very high on the agenda. It was not really seen as part of what British politics, UK politics was about, which is in itself a topic I think worth investigating, but I call it a research agenda with which I won't deal just now. What I do see is that there are very deep divisions in the United Kingdom, and these will affect the country's stability, which of course then is a factor for the European Union as a stakeholder in the future of the United Kingdom. I see a number of divisions. I think there's a constitutional division. That's to say the status of, I'll call it England, and I do mean England and not Nem Anglia, but England. Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales have asymmetrical relationships with one another. It's very seldom considered from the London perspective. London is, as you all know, I'm sure, an extraordinary place with its own very powerful dynamic, which makes it very difficult to see what the rest of the country is like. Behind this, beyond this, hidden in a way, is the question of England. What does it mean to be English? There's a post-imperial English identity struggling to get out. But we don't really know what it is, except that much of it, being of Englishness, is being defined as we are not EU, we are not European. We all know there have been 1,000 years of dispute, friction with France, to some extent, much lesser extent with Germany. Historically, both countries have been both opponents, enemies, and allies. But that's a relationship which I think has turned fairly sour. Part of it is to do with the popular media, which have taken a very anti-European line or anti-continental line, fascinating in its own terms, but that, to my mind, is what the construction of an identity is about. To some degree, a much lesser degree, but I think it's still there, some of this is antagonism towards Scotland above all the Barnett formula, on the basis of which Scotland receives quite a large sum of money from the UK Exchequer, much more than it pays in. And some of that has worked its way at the popular level into the English identity. I don't know what the outcome will be, because it's a process being constructed at this very time. But it clearly influences how the political class, opinion formers, see the rest of the world, the United Kingdom itself, and of course the European Union. The second division to which I want to draw your attention is the one between London and what I'm going to call non-London. Some of you may know the work of Christophe Guilly, a French geographer, who talks about the internal periphery in France. There was quite an interesting article by him in The Guardian about 10 days ago. And what we're seeing in France today, the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, is in a way Guilly's prophecy. He wrote this book about 4 years ago, Fractured France, I think it's called, that there is a globalized France and a non-globalized France, and the latter really is not integrated into the French political republican tradition. And I see some of this being replicated, or at least paralleled, I think is the better word, in the United Kingdom. By the way, elsewhere. I mean, this is not a uniquely French or British problem. We can see equivalents pretty much in every European country in one form or another. So there's a disequilibrium. This is what I'm getting at. Some of which is economic. Partly to do with differential rates of real income growth in different parts of the country. Those of you who know London, I'm sure will find it very exciting. And then if you start going north, to places that none of you probably has ever visited, I'm thinking of somewhere like West Hartlepool, northeast of England, people are not starving. Don't get me wrong, but there's a palpable difference between the dynamism of the southeast, which produces, Peter will correct me, sort of 50% of the UK's GDP. It is a disproportion, it's an asymmetry. And this is to do also with the centralization. I mean, in the last 30 years, there has really been an extraordinary centralization of administrative processes in the United Kingdom. Scotland, obviously, separate. It runs its own administration. Northern Ireland, Wales to a lesser extent. There's a concentration of power, and with power, prestige in London, which, of course, means that the asymmetry I've been talking about is continuously reproduced. And then there's a loss of status on the parts of, I'll call it non-London, I already called it that. But this is a part of the loss of control that Peter was talking about. There's a loss of control, obviously, vis-à-vis the European Union, its legislative power, much of which is unaccountable. Here I'm very much on the same page as Peter. I think there's a huge amount of power accumulated in Brussels, which is not accountable. We in Parliament, some of us try to do our best. A great many people have a kind of inherent belief in the virtue of ever more integration. This is certainly not my position. So in that sense, the loss of control is a general experience of all the 28 countries, not for very long. It will soon be 27 in the European Union. So where do we go from here? Well, I can't dictate. I have no idea what the politics of the United Kingdom will be, but the problems that I've sketched will not go away. They have to be looked at. The constitutional arrangements of the United Kingdom are internal matter, but it's something that has to be faced if you accept my argument that there's an asymmetry. Without this, the disequilibria, the decorrelation will continue, and the other parts of the United Kingdom will function as an irritant. To some degree, it will destabilize, not in any extreme fashion, but it will be something that the London government will continuously have to look at. That's why it seems to me that some kind of stabilization through a constitutional rearrangement should be a part of the agenda. And as I've already suggested, this is something which the European Union also has to face. What is to be the future of the relationship between the member states and Brussels? So there are different levels of asymmetry. I'll say, I've got a couple more minutes that I'll use here. Historically, what the European Union was established to do, among other things, was to correct these disequilibria, these asymmetries of power. The European Union was an absolutely superb conflict resolution mechanism. It's lost its function, not completely. But think about it, there are all sorts of hidden conflicts or conflicts that are not self-evident with which the European Union is not dealing. Think about Cyprus. It's been divided since 75. I think 75 is the year. The European Union, to the best of my knowledge, has never said a single word about Catalonia. Now, this is very strange, because there's a major crisis in Spain. You can argue it in legal terms, political terms, but you can't get away from it. Right off the agenda, but bubbling away beneath the surface, we should all know about this, is the Croatian-Slovenian frontier dispute. I won't go into the arcana, but it's there. European Union is dead quiet. That tells me that that particular approach to Europe of solving problems of conflict is not taken very seriously. I think it's been replaced by human rights, which has its own particular problematic. If you say that human rights transcends everything, which many people do, you're making a moral statement, and the problem with that is that it's very difficult to compromise morality, and politics is about compromise. So, on that particular note, I'll leave you. Would you give me back to John, and thank you for your attention.
I take it this is working, yes. Thank you very much, George. Thank you, Peter. I'm now going to invite both the speakers to respond briefly, probably 2-3 minutes, to each of them specifically to what the other has said. Then I'll ask a few questions. So let me begin by asking you, Peter, to respond directly to what you've just heard from George.
Well, George is... Sorry. Do I press anything?
Is it working?
Is it working? Yes. Good. First of all, George's whole presentation was extremely perceptive, and it's always valuable to us in the UK to have the views of someone who's lived a great period of time in our country and knows it, but can also look with a degree of detachment. On the first point, that Europe will always be a factor in British politics, that's undoubtedly true. But I think the sort of relationship which will develop between the United Kingdom and the European Union will be similar to that between Canada and the United States of America. Undoubtedly, America is a major factor in what Canada does, but Canada nonetheless sees itself as a separate country, has no intention of becoming a state or states of the United States of America, and that's sort of not an issue, though it was an issue a century and a half ago. So will be more like that, and hopefully we'll have some kind of free trade agreement with Europe, just as Canada has the NAFTA agreement with the United States of America. Secondly, the issue of the allocation of power within the European Union. The reason resentment towards membership of the European Union has grown over the years, the 45 years Britain's been in the European Union, is that it has seen an ebbing of power away from Parliament towards the European Union, and the consciousness that that would continue. And it will continue, and it must continue, because the European Union has made a central part of its project the creation of a single currency. And there's never been a currency in the history of the world without a government to run it, equipped with powers to tax and spend and borrow and transfer money from the better off areas to the less well-off areas, and those affected by various economic changes more than others. So if the euro is to survive, the European Union has to go through that process of centralisation. There's no way you'd persuaded the British people to be part of it. You may or may not be able to persuade the European nations to be part of it. The remaining 27 states of the European Union to be part of it. If you do, it will survive and the European Union will become more like a nation state itself. If not, the Euro project will have to be abandoned. I expect the former is more likely than the latter. Finally, something I didn't mention is that our democratic tradition in the United Kingdom is different from that of many countries on the continent. Not entirely. There are perhaps 5 countries in Europe which have a long history of either parliamentary or plebiscitary democracy. Switzerland, Iceland, Norway, United Kingdom, Denmark and Sweden, so 6. All of those are the countries who find it membership of the European Union most difficult. 3 of them have chosen not to join. The others within it are constantly finding life difficult. The Swedes simply had a referendum and announced they weren't going to join the euro, even though they're by treaty bound to do so. The Danes managed to get a formal exclusion, and so on. So democracy, our way of doing things, is quite difficult to reconcile with the European Union's way of doing things, and creates frictions and tensions. But we resolving that by leaving, others will have to resolve it within their membership of the European Union. I think that's enough from me.
Thank you. George.
Thank you very much. Let me say a few things about what Peter has said. First of all, it's very clear from the events of this week that the agreement of the 25th of November, which I hope will be called the St. Catherine's Day Agreement, because that's the 25th of November, is not going to be changed. I think it's what I missed from Peter's analysis is that the weariness in Brussels with the whole negotiation process. If you want a historical analogy, it's a bit like the Paris Peace Settlement after 1918, when everybody just wanted an agreement. They no longer cared all that much about the actual terms of the agreement. They just wanted to be rid of it, because it went on and on and on. And it's 2.5 years. And I think there's a sense that a great deal of time, effort and energy has gone into trying to find a deal with the United Kingdom. This has now happened. That's it. Minor assurances, I think, is the right word that Peter used. It may just be possible, but there's no changes of substance. And I think that has to be part of the equation. On Canada plus, well, I very much hope that this is right. I would, however, say that it took about 6 years to negotiate the free trade deal with Canada. It's not going to be easy, and I entirely accept the figures that you gave about tariffs, but don't forget the non-tariff barriers. They are, in some respects, even more important health and safety, regulations, standards, and so on. And yes, the European Union is very bureaucratic. Having a single standard in so many areas for 27 member states necessarily means that, whether we like it or not. Value chains. These will be difficult to maintain if there are different standards. Not impossible. It requires the goodwill on both sides, the political will to sustain them. In your response, you talked about the allocation of power in the European Union. You think that this will continue. I'm not so sure. I actually see, at least that's my guess, that we're on the threshold of a significant change in the distribution of power in Europe. It's a very parliamentary perspective. I'm ready to acknowledge that. The next parliament will be very different from this one. This parliament is strongly federalist. It gets very tiresome listening to the same speeches over and over again, I can tell you. But that's politics, as they say. The next parliament will be much less federalist. And I think that there will be major conflict between parliament and the Commission. The Commission, I'll be kind and I will say, they're fanatical in their federalism. They really do believe in a federal Europe. Well, I don't, and I don't think actually it's possible. Here we're looking at a very, very serious problem that, this is right, vast amounts of power have accumulated in Brussels. Much of this is perfectly respectable, like, I don't know, environmental standards, food safety and so on. The problem is that this power is not really accountable. Parliament does what it can. Some of what Parliament does is unbelievably technical, difficult to explain to outsiders. It's very, very undramatic, so it's difficult to get a public input into this. Besides, there's no such thing as a European public opinion. There's no European demos, which makes the accountability that much more difficult. So, by the same token, when Peter suggested that the European Union will become a nation state, or no, I'm sorry, like a nation state, I don't think so. I think that the serious tensions which I think will block this, and above all, you talked about, quite properly, the Scandinavian countries having a different parliamentary tradition, which I think is right, but actually some of the members of the awkward squad are here in Central Europe. We also have different traditions, not necessarily parliamentary traditions, although we do have those as well. But above all, the growing sense that we've got a bad deal out of the European Union. Now, I published this article, you remember this, John, in Hungarian Review, taking some data from the very left-wing French economist, Thomas Piketty, made it very clear that the amount of capital exported from Central Europe exceeds the amount of money which Central Europe receives through structural funds. So in other words, in that sense, we're net payers into the European Union, although we're much poorer than France or Germany or Netherlands and so on. And this is a political reality as well as an economic one. And I think that what we're seeing in the last few years is an increasing sense of, well, I don't know, certainly dislike, disagreement, even disdain for the way in which Brussels works. So I'm not persuaded that the enlargement of 2004, 2007, 2011 has actually worked as well as it's widely believed in Brussels and elsewhere.
George, thank you very much. Now, my first question arises almost directly from your closing remarks there, so I'll put it first to you. Obviously, if Britain does withdraw, this is going to change, if all this is finalised and signed, sealed and delivered, this is going to change power balances within the European Union. For the last 45 years, for the reasons I think that Peter gave, Britain has been, so to speak, a factor retarding the moves towards a more centralized Europe, a more federal Europe. It didn't join the euro. It's, until quite recently at least, been a factor in discouraging the real development of a European security and defense policy. Again, that seems to be speeding up, at least on the surface. And and finally, the balance of power geographically will shift somewhat, surely, if the westernmost power removes itself from the European balance of power geographically. So, what will, in your view, the Europe be like 10 or 20 years after the British are no longer there?
Can I have the crystal ball? I have no idea. I could make some guesses because you could see some of the structures already. I'm open to correction, but my sense is that the Visegrad countries are already a more important trading partner for Germany than France. In other words, there's been some shift, certainly in economic power. Politically, no. Politically, obviously, it's always been the Franco-German relationship that's driven the European Union. When I was much younger, I can still remember the Axe-Paris-Bonn, the Paris-Bonn axis of de Gaulle going to Germany and saying, "Du großes deutsches Volk," you great German people. It was a very different Germany around. The Bonn Republic, I think, was a very different country from the Berlin Republic. And what I see at the moment is that both France and Germany are weakening. France, I've talked about. I think that Macron turns out to be every bit as unsuccessful as a president as his predecessors. You will recall Hollande, you will recall Sarkozy, or even Chirac. Maybe in a slightly frivolous way, France is even more difficult to govern than any other European country, etc. There is a strong Republican tradition which I think is being flouted by the way in which France has developed. Let me add, as a Hungarian, I don't think we should have a Clemenceau Avenue in Budapest. I think France treated us very, very badly in Trianon, but it's difficult not to admire France, and they really do have the best cheese in Europe. The German problem actually is that although the German economy performs quite well, it depends, not exclusively, but very strongly on the Eurozone being there. And if the Eurozone does collapse, which I wouldn't exclude entirely, the German economy will be in dire straits, to which some recent figures that something like 30 to 40% of German society has seen no increase in its real income. There's growing dissatisfaction. You will all know about the Alternative für Deutschland, the far centre-right, I'm not sure exactly how to call the far centre-right party. What it doesn't come through very readily is that its support is not the losers of globalization, but, if you like, respectable middle-class Germans, in some respects the functional equivalents of those who voted for Brexit. And they're on a steady 15%. Once or twice in the polls, they've actually exceeded public opinion polls, the Social Democrats. That, to my mind, is one of the defining features of Europe today, the collapse of social democracy. And have a look, all around Europe, Social Democratic Party, I think one or two exceptions, are doing very badly. And those that are doing well, I think, are Social Democratic only in name. I'm thinking of Malta, Romania, to some extent Spain. I'm not even sure that actually the Labour Party is a Social Democratic Party, although Corbyn is doing his best. So I would say that the balance in Europe is altering, but what we're looking at is simultaneous linear and non-linear processes, and these are almost impossible to bring into some form of equilibrium. So watch this space.
I could just put the same question with a slightly different spin to Peter. Anyone who's been at European conferences for the last 20 or 30 years has heard politicians from Central Europe and the peripheral countries saying to the Brits, why don't you commit yourself to Europe and be the leader of, so to speak, all of the smaller countries against the Franco-German colossus. Now, if we're not going to be there to play that role, first of all, how well did we play it when we were? And secondly, what kind of role will we play as one of influence from outside in these debates?
Well, first, I don't think it should be a primary objective of British policy to influence the balance of power or direction of the European Union. That's up to the people in the European Union. It would be anomalous if we said we want to get control of our own laws, but we still want to control other people's or influence them to any great degree. Obviously, there's always a mutual influence of some kind, if only by emulation and example. I often set people a quiz question: what's the most influential country in the world in the last 60 years? And the answer, I think, is New Zealand. New Zealand has pioneered most of the changes which other countries have followed, from setting up central banks to reorganize. Welfare states, votes for women, setting up the health service, subsequent reorganisations of welfare and so on. Their influence has come by setting an example, not by power. So there are two kinds of influence you can have. One is doing something well or badly, and other people will learn from your successes or mistakes, and the other is by power. Britain will be influential solely by example, not by power, when it's a self-governing country, again, or primarily. What was the other part of your question? Or have I answered it?
I think you've answered it. Thank you. I'd now like to put a completely different question, but one of great importance. One of the elements of the debate in Britain in the last few months has been that despite the fact that several leading generals and former heads of intelligence have kept raising the question of the commitment of Britain to a much closer defence structure in Europe. In other words, Mrs. May's withdrawal agreement includes the idea that Britain should commit itself much more to the growing defence union arrangements within Europe, within the Union, in a way that previously the British were at the very best reluctant and at worst positively an intentional obstacle to them. Why has this issue not in sense been given greater attention? It hasn't got much attention in debate. And what will be the results if, is this one of the reasons, however, why there is such resistance in the House of Commons to the withdrawal agreement?
It is a factor for a certain number of MPs, Conservative MPs, who have an interest in defence and experience in it. I've never been a soldier and never served in the military, and it's not an area I've specialised in, but I hear my colleagues expressing the concerns about elements of the proposed deal and commitments that Theresa May has made on this front without any great publicity, which worries them. They don't like the idea of us being militarily committed to a European Union proto-army. We have always looked on NATO, multilateral, multi-governmental organisation, as the basis of security in Europe, and we don't want to undermine that by sucking power out of that into some new organisation in which we would commit troops but have no vote or influence.
Let me turn the same question, George, to you for this reason, that although Hungary is in general reluctant to cede power to Brussels, and increasingly so, and increasingly vocally, yet Viktor Orban on this question strongly favours the European army. And I wonder what you think is now going to happen as a result both of the British withdrawal. Will that result in a greater willingness on the part of the Europeans to proceed with these more and more complex and comprehensive military arrangements?
Well, I think the answer to your question, it's already happening. Something is very, very slowly coming into being in the defence area. It's still very fuzzy. We don't know exactly what it will look like. Whether it will amount to a single European army, I beg leave to doubt. But certainly there are areas where, however many of the 27 are willing to participate in this, there are shared interests, separate from those which are in NATO. Not all EU members are NATO members as well. military standards. I mean, I've now forgotten, I think there are about 160 different rifles which are around in the EU states. Now, this is absurd. And I think that the interoperability of systems is only now beginning to be thought about. Then there are areas, if you follow this, you will know that much of the technological innovation in the United States derives from military spending. There's very, very little of this in Europe. So the amount in the new financial framework, there is money to be set aside for this. If it happens, member states have still to agree, which means that the technological innovation in which Europe is not very good, we're way behind the United States on this, has a possibility of improving. And I think there's also intelligence sharing, which is very poor at the moment. So I'm not talking about external threats, but I'm talking about terrorism, security problems. And here, of course, the United Kingdom has played a sort of semi-offstage role. It's been a part and it's not been a part. The UK's commitment has always been to NATO and really deeply disliked any kind of EU defence agreement, although it's there on the treaty. I think it's Article 42, but don't remember now. And of course, with the announcement that the United Kingdom would withdraw, the other EU countries, or some of them at any rate, have said, okay, we'll go ahead, we'll try to do something in the military sphere. I think Hungary's commitment on this is a recognition that we're a small country, we can't defend ourselves on our own. In the last 600 years, Hungary has only participated in one war on the winning side, and that's the Gulf War. Not a brilliant military record. So there are clear Hungarian interests in being part of a wider defence community.
Now let me turn to the audience and ask people if they would like to both ask questions but also to make brief statements. I think we have a number of people in the audience who are themselves experts in some of the topics raised. So let me throw open the discussion to the floor. Who is the first person who would like to ask the first question? Yes, the gentleman there. And a microphone is coming to you.
Firstly, thank you very much for a very enlightening discussion. As many of you will know, Scottish nationalism has been resurgent in the past 2 decades, and Scotland voted about 62% to remain. Could a strong Brexit hasten the demise of the Union, and if so, is that a price worth paying for a full exit from the euro? So. I'm
going to ask Peter to respond to that first, but also later, George, because you lived and worked in Scotland for many years.
That's an important issue. It's particularly important to me. I claim Scottish ancestry. My second name is Bruce, which is a typically Scottish name. And if Scotland were to separate from the United Kingdom, it would be like having an arm pulled off my body. It won't happen, I don't think. For a start, something like, I believe it was 1 million Scots who voted Scottish nationalist also voted to leave the European Union. They're logical. They prefer self-government or local government to government at a distance. The Scottish National Party is different. I mean, the Scottish National Party used to be committed to leaving the European Union. It reversed and became a purely anti-English party. And it's essentially that. But what happened at the last general election was very important. The Conservatives have been down to 1 seat in Scotland. They won 13. And that was, despite the fact that, as you say, a majority of Scots had voted to remain in the European Union, but they were more afraid of a second referendum in Scotland to reopen the independence question, and/or wanted us to leave the European Union. And so we've reversed a 50-year trend and became the second biggest party in Scotland. The mood in Scotland is the last thing they want is any more referenda. They've had an independence referendum for Scotland, which was very divisive. They've had a referendum to leave the European Union. They don't want another one. And I think that issue's been put to bed. It was one of the few good consequences of Mrs. May unwisely calling a general election. It did see off the likelihood and the momentum of independence in Scotland.
George.
Indeed. I think it was in 1955 that the Conservatives had an absolute majority of seats in Scotland.
Votes, yes.
And the seats as well. Yes. So things have changed. Scotland shifted to the left. Where you put the Scottish National Party on that political spectrum is difficult to say. It's more a left-wing party than a right-wing party, but even these categories of left and right are very difficult to define precisely. Now, I fully agree. I think there is a fatigue in Scotland with respect to the whole question of independence. Opinion is deeply divided, roughly 55% in favour of the Union, the remainder against, or certainly there will be some people who are in between. So I don't think, at any rate, in the short term, there will be any move towards declaration of independence. It also raises very difficult constitutional issues for the UK, plus things like what happens to the currency. What will independent Scotland do? Try to join the European Union, which means it would have to accept the euro and things of this kind. So there are all sorts of really hard problems. My guess is that not in the short term, but in the sort of medium term, sort of 3 to 5 years, there will be proper discussions between London and Edinburgh as to the kind of relationship that exists and should exist between these disparate parts of the United Kingdom. Not, I think, independence, but look, things always go wrong. Accidents do happen. It could be that opinion gels suddenly in favour of independence, which I think would be an undesirable outcome, because that would add to the resentment in England, but also, I think, to some degree, the relief, no more money being paid to Scots. So it's a complicated issue without a simple answer.
Thank you. Next question. Gentleman at the back, just there. No, behind you, Miss. Behind you. Yeah, and then Shandor.
Thank you very much. So first, very short comment. I beg to differ that it's not Britain's duty, the balance of power in Europe, because that was basically the main policy goal, foreign policy goal for the last 400, 500 years of Britain. But my question would be that what can Britain do to unite its people? Because there was a very short margin at the referendum. And what can the British politics after Brexit do to reassure those people who wanted to remain, voted to remain, but still they have to leave the European, and otherwise, if it's a quite close relationship with the European Union, what can you do to reassure Brexiteers? Thank you.
Peter.
I think you mean to reassure anti-Brexiteers, don't you? You mean, what can we do to reassure anti-Brexiteers?
Yeah.
I represented a seat which voted about 60% to remain, although I was campaigning to leave. They consisted of 2 or 3 sorts of people who were voting remain in my constituency. A very large number on the doorstep said, Mr. Lilley, we don't particularly like the European Union, but we're afraid if we leave that we'll lose our jobs. We've been told that by our employers. They work in the city or whatever, and we'll have to move to Frankfurt or what, you know. So there was a fear factor. There was another sort of niceness factor, that we don't particularly like the European Union, but we don't want to be associated with racism and people like Mr. Farage. So it was a sort of trying not to be tainted by something. And the third group, the smallest group, were those who actually believed in the European Union. So the fear factor will disappear when they find that all these threats don't materialize. They've found one range of threats hasn't materialized. The Treasury put out a forecast saying that the mere vote to leave would cause the British economy to go into recession, that it would contract by 3.6%, that the unemployment would rise by between 500,000 and 800,000 in the ensuing 2 years. Well, we've had the ensuing 2 years. the economy didn't go into recession. It's grown reasonably strongly. The number of jobs, instead of declining, has risen by 500,000. So they've realised that set of fear was nonsense. They've now got a different set. The new project fear is the demonisation of what's called no deal, i.e. WTO terms, which is something the whole establishment has been trying to frighten us all with. The BBC will never talk about WTO terms. They talk about crashing out with no deal. They should talk about cashing in and keeping £39 billion. That's what happens if you have no deal. You save an awful lot of money. But they will never use that phrase. So they'll find that we're a bit better off than we might otherwise have been, instead of being much worse off. That will reconcile the frightened group. Hopefully we will reconcile the people who found some elements of what was said to be the Leave campaign distasteful. They'll find that we don't suddenly all start becoming racist or whatever. Indeed, the odd paradox since the referendum is that the Leavers said we should now move immediately and unilaterally to legislate to guarantee the rights of British citizens already in the UK. It was Mrs. May and the Remainers who said, no, we must use that as a bargaining factor against the rights of British citizens on the continent. It's absurd. No European country is going to expel British citizens, and any more than we should sort of threaten to expel European citizens living with us. So we should just get on and guarantee their rights and shame everybody else to do the same, and they will do the same. So far from leaving a sort of taint of racism, we'll all find we'll get on with each other pretty well, I hope.
George?
Yes, I'd like to take up the 400 years. It's probably rather longer, actually, that Britain has tried not to get too involved. But think about the one really important European war in which Britain was not involved, England to be precise, England and Scotland, the 30 Years' War. It dragged on for 30 years, partly because the two contesting sides were capable of blocking one another. It was fatigue, exhaustion, which finally put an end to it. And, James VI and First absolutely refused to participate, and then Charles had other things to worry about, like Cromwell. So to that extent, I think that's right. But don't forget, Europe has changed. The two world wars have radically changed Europe's attitude to internal conflict. You can see 1914-45 as a the next second 30 Years' War, European Civil War. And I think the commitment made by the founding fathers of the European Union, so I'm thinking of Schuman and Monnet and the others, de Gasperi, Adenauer, that we really now must find a way to ensure that it will never happen again. There will be no more war in Europe. This has worked very well. And I think that's changed the equation. And then Britain has a very awkward position on this because the equilibrium, which I keep talking about, is to some extent there on the continent. And therefore the possibility of the continent erupting in warfare again is now, I think, at zero, never excluded entirely. So in that sense, because the equation is different, I think the United Kingdom has to come to terms with this.
We might want to explore that later. Yes, Shandor Kerekes.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Introduced already myself, Shandor Kerekes. I have actually two small questions for the price of one. One is, isn't it true that the electorate was vastly misled, if not lied to, leading up to the referendum, and they voted under all kinds of delusions, which later turned out to be very bitter and turned out to be lies. Lies of how nice and how wonderful it will be to break out of the European Union, and mainly Nigel Farage and his crew, but also even Prime Minister Cameron was not entirely blameless in this respect. But my real question is this. If the import tariffs are, as you say, 13%, I remember you said?
4%.
4%. No, that was the export.
Well, it'll be the same in each direction.
Very well. Whatever it may be, the percentage, the pound amount will not be as large or larger as the 13 billion that you might save. And in fact, wouldn't it be the British public who will pay those tariffs? And in consequence, wouldn't it raise the inflation rate? Now, completely independent and homegrown. And I might just note Mr. Carney's respecting notes about the consequences to that respect. Okay? Thank you.
I think that's for you, Peter.
Well, first of all, it is faintly amusing that the Remain side now say the British public were lied to. And they talk about it as if throughout the campaign, the only side putting forward any claims to the British people were the Leave side. Actually, it was a democratic election. Both sides were there. You were allowed to criticise what the other side said. If you thought it was a lie, you said, look, they're lying. This is untrue. The principle, you say it was a lie because the Leave side said it would be nice when we leave. Well, we haven't yet left, so we don't know whether that's going to be true or not. I think it will be true, that actually we will both have control of our laws, our money and our borders, and that will, in the long run, make us marginally better off. But we won't know until afterwards. The one story that the Remain side latch onto is on the side of the battle bus, which the Leave campaign drove around the country, said, we give Europe £350 million a week, why don't we spend our money on the NHS? And the Remain campaign said, that's the gross amount we give the European Union, and therefore it was a lie. Well, fair enough. The net amount is £200 million a week. If they put £200 million a week, let's spend it on the NHS, would the result have been different? It came up at every public meeting. I debated this day in, day out, sometimes 2 or 3 meetings a day. Every time the Remainers would say, oh, this is a lie, it's not 350 million. I'd say, no, what is it? It's 200 million. I never used any other figure. Is there anyone here who now knows that we'll only save £200 million net who will change their vote? And not 350? No one ever, it didn't make any difference to the outcome. The reason they quoted the high figure was to make it controversial, so that their hope was that the Remainers would say, no, it's only 200 million. And then we'd say, so they only think it's only 200 million. Actually, the Remainers were more sensible and pretended it was 0, which was a lie. But anyway, there we are. So the lies business is nonsense. Politicians are always accused of lying if they disagree with you. But in a democratic society, you've got a chance to expose lies and disagree with people in public, and that happens. Second, tariffs. Yes, the average tariff will be 4% on our exports to the EU. That's £5 or £6 billion a year. What the exports from Europe to us will incur 13 billion. You're right. If we leave the tariffs at that level, some of that will come out of the profits of German car manufacturers and others. Some of it will raise the cost of living. Most of people like me think we should slash our tariffs, so we'll still get some money, but the rest of it we'll either slash the tariffs or use the money to reduce value-added tax and cut the cost of living. So that would moderate the effect on the cost of living, but you're right, there would be an effect on the cost of living if we retain the same tariffs against European goods as we currently have against the rest of the world. If we reduce both, the impact's less. And finally, you mentioned Monsieur Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, a Canadian called Mr. Carney, who says that if we're not part of the currency of a customs union, It will have a disastrous effect on the British economy. He has ambitions to be Prime Minister of Canada when he returns. I bet he doesn't propose that Canada joins a customs union with the United States of America, nor will he tell the people of Canada that they're going to be vastly worse off if they don't join a customs union with the United States of America. He's sadly undermined the credibility and independence and political neutrality of the Bank of England, and that's regrettable.
George.
Thank you very much. I don't want to get involved in the economic argument. I think it's something that one can argue in many directions, but I want to suggest that it's misleading to look only at the economics. As I tried to argue, it's a question of many other factors like identity, culture, and above all, political power. So in that sense, the economic argument, which to some extent both the pro-Brexit and anti-Brexit side focused, is misleading. It wasn't just about that. I'm always resistant to single-factor explanations. Secondly, I want to say something about Nigel Farage. We're on fairly good terms. I find him highly entertaining. He's a joker, not to be taken terribly seriously, but he does enliven the sitting of the European Parliament because he's incredibly rude to people, which can be quite entertaining. But about 6 months before the vote, I shared a parliamentary car with him, and I said to him, Nigel, are you going to win this? He said, oh, I don't think so.
Well, I think a lot of people who were on the Leave side didn't think so as well, as a matter of fact. I didn't think so. I was very surprised on election night, for example. Yeah, but so it's, I mean, he wasn't, you can't read a great deal into that comment, it seems to me.
No, I just offered it for entertainment, nothing else. In other words, no one's a prophet, even when they want to be.
I'd like to, sorry, let me ask another question from the floor. A gentleman here and the gentleman there. Yes. Why don't we take two questions, one after the other?
Thank you very much. So my question is whether Hungary or the V4 countries profit in any way from Britain's departure from the EU, or have we lost the UK forever? I mean, what are the fields or opportunities that will open up, and how the United Kingdom sees this region after Brexit? Because I have a feeling that the attention of the UK is shifting to other alliances, like the nations of Commonwealth or the US. And I would be curious to know whether you see any new opportunities that can arise as a consequence of Britain's departure.
I'm also going to ask you to put the question if I could. This gentleman has represented Hungary in the United States.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the speakers for their excellent contributions. I've had the feeling that we may be circling around the $64,000 question, which is, what if the EU makes an offer that will not be acceptable to the majority of the House of Commons? Then what will happen is, are there any scenarios for this? And what's your take on the possibility that we may face a situation whereby the majority would rally for a new referendum? Thank you very much.
George first, maybe both questions.
Okay, I'll try to answer. Well, on V4 gaining and losing, I think to some degree the Visegrad countries are losing, probably not all that much, but if the analysis that I offered you before on the new equilibria in Europe come into being, then the V4 will to some extent gain if they can sustain their unity. With respect to Berlin, Paris to some extent, but you know, perhaps it's very short term. But I see the power of France declining to some extent. We'll see how that plays. As far as the UK is concerned, I think that British attention was never all that strong as far as Central Europe is concerned. 2005, I think that was the second half, was the British presidency, and Blair really did have a chance to offer some kind of leadership to the new member states which he didn't take up. And when he tried to put the then financial framework together, he actually said, why don't you ask for less money? And you can imagine the response to that. I think Warsaw was totally scathing. So in that sense, I think that for Britain, Central Europe is of tertiary interest, always has been. Stability in Europe, yes, but so far we haven't played such a big role in stability, in spite of the fact of 2 world wars breaking out just in this region. On the offer, well, I actually think that the European Union has made this offer. This is the 25th of November offer. And, well, what Peter is suggesting, but it's his answer, is that this offer is not acceptable to the United Kingdom. It may be tweaked, I don't know. It's absolute, impossible to tell at this particular time, but I'll really leave the answer to Peter. It's his baby.
But before you do that, let me just put this point to you. What about the item which is the one that seems to be causing most concern in Parliament and certainly in the Tory party, the item that you're not able to leave the backstop without the agreement of the EU? It seems to me that the idea that somehow or other Article 50 no longer applies to the relationship between Britain and Europe is the sticking point.
Well, I think Article 50 does apply, but of course there are questions of interpretation, as with all legal matters. And Article 50 certainly applies in this most recent decision of the court that it can be withdrawn, which until then we all thought, we in Brussels, no, it couldn't be. But now it appears from the ruling of the court that if the United Kingdom wants to withdraw its declaration of leaving the European Union under Article 50, it can do. As far as the backstop is concerned, my sense of it is that as far as Brussels is concerned, they never want to use it. In other words, that the arrangement will come into being, whether it's like the one that Peter outlined or not, I can't say, will actually make the backstop unnecessary. But it's so messy from all sides that it could very well go back to the Luxembourg court again over something or another, much to the dislike of everybody, including, of course, London, which really dislikes the court. To some degree, I can see why.
First of all, about whether Hungary will lose or gain from Britain's departure, I'm not sure to what extent you'd have gained by us remaining, except insofar as we would slow down the process of integration, try to thwart the process of integration, and probably fail, so it would happen anyway, but just a bit more slowly. The idea that there's a great hubris in my country that whenever we talk about relations with the Visegrad countries or Europe as a whole, we always say we should take a leadership role. Why on earth should anyone follow Britain rather than follow their own interests? I just don't understand it. And what they usually mean is Britain should sign up to the teleological process of European federalism. Thereby we'll gain influence because people would say, oh, you're genuine Europeans now, and then we'll be able to use that to thwart the process of European federalism. Well, that seems neither honourable nor credible as a strategy, but it's the one that's been urged on British governments ever since John Major said, we are at the heart of Europe, we're going to therefore be more influential. So I think we can dismiss all that. And Hungary should pursue its own interests, within the European Union, and I'm sure will. Will there be a new referendum? It's conceivable, but very unlikely. It will require legislation. It will require us to extend the Article 50. No, there's no chance of us repealing Article 50. That was endorsed by 550 members of Parliament against 100. We would have to agree on the question. And that's very difficult. Some people say, well, if there is, we've taken the decision to leave, so that side of the question's been resolved. It's just whether we leave on Mrs. May's terms or on WTO terms. Now, the people who want a referendum want a different question. They want us to have a choice between Mrs. May's terms and staying in. So, you know, how would you resolve that different? Perhaps you could have a referendum on what the question should be. It's very difficult. So that's rather unlikely. There is the possibility that Mrs. May will come back and say, I've only got these assurances. Well, she won't. She'll say, I've got these wonderful assurances. They're really going to try jolly hard to find some solution other than remaining indefinitely in the backstop, because they don't like it, though they insist on having it. And having it legally binding, whereas these assurances will not be. The odds are that will be defeated in the Parliament. It's conceivable that my colleagues will be lent upon and will agree to it. I can't see where you're going to get 100 of them to change their minds. 40 of them I know are pretty irreconcilable. So you're then left with just sort of prolonging our membership while we renegotiate, or leaving on WTO terms. And I honestly don't know what the outcome's going to be. But I think, you know, leaving on WTO terms is much more likely, and I've been saying this for 2 years, than anybody recognizes. And that it should not be ruled out, nor is it terribly catastrophic for anybody. It's not the best option, but it's much better than Mrs. May's option.
I have another question which I would like to put before, and that is this. Peter, just before, Nigel Lawson, whom we, very distinguished former Chancellor of the Exchequer, was asked during the campaign, if we leave, what is the alternative for Britain outside Europe? And he said the alternative to being in the European Union is not being in the European Union, which most countries in the world are not. Now, on the other hand, there is this slight sense of nervousness of being alone in the world in British politics. That argument has been used a lot in the last 20 or 30 years. And I know that 2 days ago, when Mrs. May was facing her vote of confidence, you were in fact talking to a Commonwealth organisation. And I wonder if you have any answers to the question of what is there an alternative in the sense of a group of countries to which Britain would naturally cohere in the event of, as we carried through our plans to leave the European Union?
You're right, there is a certain nervousness about being alone, as it's called, which is to say, being in much the same position as most other independent countries. Nigel Lawson is absolutely right. The alternative to being in the European Union is not then you trade with other countries, you try and negotiate free trade deals with other countries. I'm in favour of having free trade deals with other countries, but the importance of free trade deals is grossly exaggerated. It's better to have one than not have one, but what basically fuels trade is making goods and providing services that other people want to buy. Having a trade deal will sort of remove some obstacles, make it a bit more profitable, but that's all. Germany has a fantastic exports to China. It doesn't have a trade deal with China. It happens to produce machine tools and engineering products that China needs at this stage of development. If we, Britain, want to prosper, we have to produce goods and services other people want to sell. Yes, let's negotiate trade deals, but if you have a trade deal with someone and you don't produce goods they want, it won't be much use. So I constantly argue this. We will have friends in the Commonwealth. We closely associated with Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and other Commonwealth countries. We've been invited, if we leave properly and leave the customs union, that's a precondition, to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That already includes Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and Canada. We will be the only non-Pacific country to belong. But Japan wants us to belong, as do other countries in Chile and so on. So we would suddenly be that part of that trading arrangement. Useful, important, let's do it. And I think it will be useful, but there is a sort of moral weakness in my compatriots, that because we are so used to belonging to clubs in London, we think we have to belong to clubs in the world. You don't have to belong to clubs, you just have to make goods and services people want to buy, and then you're prosperous economically, and form alliances with people who have a natural interest in terms of military and strategic cooperation, and then you'll get on in the world.
Thank you. Yes, of course.
I just want to add one thing. We focused a lot on trade and therefore on tariffs, but I want to suggest that trade deals, while a very helpful condition for economic prosperity, in themselves are neither necessary nor a sufficient condition. Above all, because the world is moving towards services rather than goods. I don't want to underestimate the significance of goods, and that's when non-tariff barriers become highly significant. They're much more important for services than for goods, and non-tariff barriers should not be neglected. Some trade deals will offer concessions on non-tariff barriers, but they're the real problem within Europe, and this is where the great strength of the single market lies, that you can sell anything within the 28 so far countries without having certificates of origin. Just the one is sufficient, and factors of this kind. That's where the difficulties arrive with the various trade deals, and each one that the European Union negotiates is somewhat different. So it's not a single homogeneous concept, it's much more diverse than that.
Let me ask a question to both of you directly arising from what George has just said, which is, do any of the arguments you've made, George, either on trade just now or earlier in the discussion, are they changed in any serious way by the fact that the internet is itself changing trade dramatically? For example, it looks likely as though there's going to be far less trade in the sense of people putting washing machines onto container ships in Taiwan and sending it out, as opposed to trade in the services you described, but in also relationships of trade and political kind and other kinds are going to be, what extent are they going to be altered by the internet, and to what extent does it affect your geopolitical outlook?
Well, I think we're talking about something which has happened. The way in which economic relationships between countries have changed over the last 10, 15 years has been quite revolutionary. Instant communication, also the liberation of capital. Capital is no longer tied to any one country. It moves around where it finds the best possible outlets. And I think that's accelerated by the communication revolution. So it seems to me that the entire digital future, or maybe it's actually a digital present, is shifting the way, qualitatively changing the character of economic interactions. And I think it's irreversible. So we have to look at the reality. And in that sense, the relationship between the future relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union must take these factors into account, and I'm not sure that many people are thinking particularly in these terms.
On these non-tariff barriers, yes, non-tariff barriers are barriers, some of them, but it's a sort of useful thing for people to wave around without being specific as what barriers they're talking about. I had to introduce the single market programme of legislation in Britain ahead of 1992. It was known by that number. 1992 is the programme that was creating the single market. And it was a good idea. It said, instead of each country having its own specific standards, let's recognise each other's, and if there are barriers, then agree to remove those barriers. So thereafter, instead of having to produce 27 different ranges or 28 different ranges of washing machine, you could have one range of washing machine for the whole of Europe. Very sensible idea. It didn't give any competitive advantage to member states, because it was just as much a simplification for Japanese companies exporting to Europe. They only had to produce one range of washing machines for the whole of Europe, as for Britain or Germany, who only had to produce one range of washing machines for the whole of Europe. And that's why it didn't lead to any greater increase in trade between member states than with non-member states. Indeed, non-member states increased their exports far more rapidly to the European Union than UK did. So it was a sensible thing. The benefit wasn't primarily increase trade but reduce costs to consumers. Good, excellent. Sadly, the single market moved from being mutual recognition to centralization of regulation and imposing quite onerous and burdensome regulation on countries. Now, of course, if you want to export to Europe, once we're an independent country, if we want to export to Europe, our goods will have to meet European specifications. If you want to export cars to the United States, they have to meet United States specifications, unless you're a German car manufacturer, in which case you cheat. You know, that's a cheap jibe. But you have to meet the specifications, but you don't have to have lots of rules and regulations domestically for your domestic countries, you know, companies, which are 85% of your economy, and you can put whatever burden of regulation on them you want. So there's a much exaggeration about non-tariff barriers. You mentioned rules of origin. There's all sorts of stories going around that rules of origin cost 8% to declare that your good is made in Britain and X% of the value added is in Britain. That's simply not true. The Swiss have to fill in rules of origin and customs declarations when they trade with the EU. They've calculated it adds less than 0.1% to the cost of their trade. So it is a non-tariff barrier, but it's trivial compared with tariffs.
Thank you very much. We have about 6 minutes to go, so I'm going to ask one question and ask both speakers to respond, but also then to make their final remarks for the morning. My question is really the same question about migration. How are migration patterns likely to change as a result of Britain leaving? I'm particularly thinking of to what extent, for example, will it be more likely that migrants from Singapore, maybe India, will be coming to Britain rather than people from Romania, Central Europe, and France and Germany. First of all, George.
Well,
and then your final remarks.
Yes. Well, not much to add. I think I would say we've exhausted the subject, but I will say a couple of things. We're already seeing, I don't know if it's a net figure, but there is some outflow of EU citizens from the United Kingdom. I understand that there are now more Polish citizens leaving than arriving. This is something new. And there are some areas, the service industries in the United Kingdom, which are feeling the pinch. I think this pattern will continue. And I think and there's still a very large number of EU citizens in the United Kingdom, but there'll be very few people arriving in the years to come. So whether they will then be replaced by the people you suggested, actually, is immigration a necessary condition of economic welfare? It's a difficult question. There are some economists, but also non-economists, who say migration is the most wonderful thing since sliced bread, with which I don't agree. I think that the migration creates as many problems as it solves. Every policy has costs. You will recall not very many weeks ago we had Chris Caldwell sitting here saying much the same thing. So there will be a change, no question. But there won't be a very radical change. I think you will still hear Polish and Hungarian in Oxford Street for many years to come. Final remarks, well, it really just flows out of the discussion that we've had, which is we're looking at processes of great complexity, both in the kind of conventional sense and the technical sense of non-linear processes that we can't predict. We can't predict all the outcomes. Some of them we can try. That's what I think we've been doing this morning. But my feeling is that, and I hope I'm wrong, is that there will be losers on both sides of the channel, so both the 27 and the United Kingdom. I trust that there will also be gainers, but whether that will happen, well, you know, we'll see in the years to come.
Well, I'd agree with Georgi that there is some doubt as to whether mass immigration is a necessary feature to have economic growth. I don't think it is. Indeed, most studies show that from those who think it has a positive effect, it has a very small positive effect. Those who think it has a negative effect, it has a modest negative effect. It simply increases the number of people in a country. And so its population is bigger, but not necessarily richer. I remember going, when I was Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, I went to see the new Nissan plant, which had just been established in the northeast of England. Very impoverished area with high level of unemployment. And I asked the Japanese managers a rather silly question. I said, do you find it difficult or easy to recruit local workers who have experience of working in the car industry? It's a stupid question because there wasn't any car industry, so of course there were 0 British workers with expertise in that area. But they were very polite, the Japanese, and smiled benignly and said, no, we trained them. And they trained their workers, and those 9,000 people employed in the Nissan plant, it is now the most efficient plant in the whole Nissan worldwide effort. I went back to the Northeast with fellow members of the Select Committee of the House of Commons for leaving the European Union. I was the only supporter of leave up there, all the rest were Remainers, and we went up there and we met all the establishment. The Confederation of British Industries, the Institute Director, the local chambers of commerce, lots of local businesses, but significantly no one from Nissan. And they all apologized that the population in the Northeast had voted leave. It was the first area to report the vote on the night. They voted to leave. And they were all terribly disappointed. And I said to them, why are you disappointed? What do you fear from us leaving? And they said, we won't be able to recruit skilled labor. And I said, isn't it lucky that the Japanese didn't take that view when they established Nissan, and indeed couldn't at that stage because we didn't have access to Eastern European labor at that stage. If they had, there'd be 9,000 Polish auto workers in Nissan, and 9,000 British people would be flipping hamburgers or unemployed. And they changed the subject. We in Britain have 2 great weaknesses in our economy. Our economy is not, I'm not one of these people who sort of say everything's rosy. There are 2 great weaknesses in the British economy. A, we don't train people enough, and B, we don't invest enough. And we've created a disincentive to do both things. We've given people, and those things are of long standing, they're nothing to do with Europe, but we've created an incentive to intensify those problems by saying you can recruit cheap labor and cheap skilled labor from Europe. So you don't have to train your own people, and you don't have to invest in mechanization because you can do it with cheap labor. And it's been successful in many ways. We've imported an extra 2 million people from Europe and 3 million people from the rest of the world. And we've grown, but without any growth in productivity. So I believe that we should stop that policy and say the first priority should be to train people already here in the United Kingdom and to invest to raise productivity rather than looking for cheap labor and cheap skills elsewhere. The case always used in Britain is the National Health Service. They say we have lots of foreign nurses in Britain. Without them, the NHS wouldn't work. Quite true. But every year we turn away 30,000 people in Britain who want to train as nurses. Because the NHS has taken the view that it's cheaper to import nurses from abroad than to train up British people. So we import them from Africa, from the Philippines and elsewhere, and from Southern Europe. I think that's wrong. I think we ought to give some of those 30,000 British people the chance of becoming nurses rather than stealing nurses from other countries who've often been trained at British expense on our aid programs. It's a daft thing. 1/6 of all the nurses trained in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, now work in Britain. Is that right? Is that moral? Is that decent? I don't think so.
George, Peter, thank you very much indeed. I'm a journalist, and as you know, we throw the word historic around rather loosely, but I think this has been a historic occasion because I believe it is the very first discussion of Brexit and Europe that has taken place in an entirely good-natured and good-humoured way. And I think we owe our guests a lot for that. Also for being extremely informative, for answering all your questions, and for ensuring that we all leave this meeting far better informed, but also, in a sense, far measured in our responses to an understanding of these questions than we did when we arrived. We will also be leaving the meeting to go just around the next door for a lunch, which you can continue in a more informal way to subject our guests to interrogation. And I want, on behalf of you, to thank them and also to thank the EPP for its contribution. But Peter, George, thank you very much indeed.